We've been here for 37 years. We're a nonprofit literary center. We host literary readings and events and workshops year-round.
Thank you.
And one of the reasons why we're participating in this is because it's a public conversation.
Mm-hmm.
We have been doing Rochester Reads now for 20 years. We have a pick for next year, Omar El-Akkad, author of American War. This is something we do. And we feel strongly that this discussion should be had in the community. We're very pleased to be part of a discussion in the, throughout the community. And I feel it's important for this voice to be out there and this book as well to be out there. So that's why we're here and why this event is happening today.
I think the other thing we can say about why we're here today is that this is, in light of what Kyle said, is that this is kind of a historical community read. I think it's unique in the sense that it's not simply encouraging people in the community to read the book, but also to attend a speech by the author, and then following that in October and November, there's going to be several community discussion, problem-solving action groups that are going to meet throughout the community. We're going to develop proposals that will be presented to the State Education Department, the Board of Regents, local boards of education, in terms of how to focus on the issues, the damage, the harm that's been created by high-stakes standardized testing. I think it's important to note that in terms of what's happened with high-stakes standardized testing over the past 20 years or so in New York State, there hasn't been any significant improvement in terms of student growth and development, especially for students who are living in poor, poverty-stricken areas. There's nothing that's really changed. I mean, you'll see a few bits of data that show that maybe we got a couple percentages higher in terms of graduation rates, but other than that, there's nothing really to show that kids are becoming more productive, responsible citizens. So that's all being driven by the tests. We have a test-driven curriculum, we have a test-driven schools. It's almost a factory-type model as opposed to a real organization for teaching and learning. And that's what we're concerned about. We know that there's damage being done. We know that there's harm being done by students, schools, and their teachers being labeled as failures and going into receivership and being punished, essentially, being labeled as failures by the State Education Department and the Board of Regents. We think, as opposed to that, there ought to be more flexibility, more resources being driven that way, as opposed to simply saying that you're a failure. And it's no good for students' self-esteem, and no good for their confidence, and no good for their desire to attend schools. If you look at attendance rates, we believe that there's definitely a connection with that, because students become bored with high-stakes standardized testing, test prep, teach for the test, as opposed to focusing on not only the skills that students need, be it critical thinking, be it critical reading and writing, which is not tested for, therefore not taught, music, art, citizenship. It's not being focused upon. So our concern is to educate the public about this through this book, through the speaker, through the groups that we're having, and hopefully provoke some type of action that's going to result in change in the education system.
I think it's so hard for people who aren't in the schools regularly and aren't doing that. They listen to concerns about high-stakes testing and say, well, I took tests when I was a kid. What's the problem? Just take the test. Don't tell me your tummy's upset. Just do it. And that's not the issue. The issue is the high-stakes nature of it. When I was a kid, we took Iowa Basic Skills tests, and it was a couple days, and you just filled in bubbles, and you didn't really know why you were doing it or anything. You just did it, and then you went on. There was no build-up, nothing like that. With these tests, there's incredible build-up. And an example of the negative impact is that one school, they had this marvelous enrichment program. Kids were doing really cool project work. It was hands-on, working in teams. Awesome work, and it was part of an enrichment program for the kids that were doing better. Then the regents changed how they determined whether a school's going into receivership or not. And it was something actually that I was someone that thought that was a good idea. We were trying to tweak it. And we said, give schools extra credit if they get 4s, and give them partial credit for the kids that are getting 2s. And that would help to prevent, there was a problem where schools were just focusing on those kids right on the bubble, and we wanted to spread it out more. And I was part of the group saying, hey, that's a problem, let's spread it out more. And that was their solution, was to do extra credit for 4s. Well, what happened in that school is instead of having this wonderful enrichment program, they switched to test prep to make sure all of those smart kids make sure they get a 4 and we get extra credit, because that school was at risk of receivership. And they were terrified, and they were going to do anything possible that they could. And that's the impact that high stakes testing has on our children's education. Because then those kids, instead of being excited and vitalized and happy to go to school, were like, ugh.
I'm wondering, Henry, as a primary school teacher, did you see any impact on kids at school number 12?
Well, first of all, yes, but first of all, it's impossible to know anything that's been said here if you don't speak English.
Mm-hmm.
And in what I represent are the 17-point-some% of students in this district who are not from homes where English is spoken. There's only one bilingual program where they're taught in their native language, Spanish. But all the other linguistic groups, over 60 linguistic groups in this district, their parents wouldn't benefit from what we're saying. Luckily, I am a Spanish speaker, and at this event, if there is a Spanish group of parents, community members who are interested in having the dialogue, I can present it from the perspective of what we're discussing today. Test anxiety. I had a kindergarten student last year whose mom came up to me and said, Mr. Padron, he's not sleeping well, he's not eating well, and when we have our chats, he's so nervous about these tests that he's having to take because it's touted. It's do well, get rewards at kindergarten, have a pizza party if your class does well. So many of these incentives to do well. Well, this child was not taking it as an incentive-driven moment. He was taking it as an anxiety-provoking moment. I'm going to do well. And by the way, he was off the charts academically. He was not a struggling student. He was a couple of grade levels above. For this child, it was extremely. Then you have those who are not as academically gifted, who just sit in the room and they have very little idea of what this means, this testing, all this demand, all this attention. So anxiety in children at the kindergarten level, by the way, I'm talking about children who are 4.5 to 5.5, 6 years old, that young, is prevalent. And I saw it in my classroom over the years.
Can you just say your name and spell it, please?
My name is Henry, middle initial I, last name Padron, Henry, Padron. Hyphen Morales, but we're not in Latin America.
Was that your opening statement, Dan?
I shortened it considerably.
You know, one of the things as of a activist for public education, a Black parent, a parent educator, listen, I really believe that people are inclined to want to fix the problem. I really sincerely believe that. But when I listen to everyone, I listen to the perspectives, I think what makes me angry and sad and emotional is that we have not taken the information. So we go beyond testing. We talk about the test. We already know that we're not utilizing high stakes testing. My son graduated from School of the Arts. He didn't do well on the SAT, which is a high stakes exam. He was on an honor roll for 4 years, a black male. We say black males are failing at an alarming rate. This was a boy who did well for 4 years. He took the test. Those 4 years didn't matter. So I think that as a parent, as a taxpayer, I'd like to see us do something with these exams. If we're saying, okay, we want to be accountable, we want our superintendents, our teachers, our educators, also parents. We want parents, you know, I feel like we've been bullied into making our children. My daughter, I'm homeschooling my daughter as a result of the anxiety that she experienced starting with 3rd grade. And she had behavior problems, and that's another issue. Because I wasn't able to partner with the staff and the teachers and everyone that was a part of making her, compete, being able to learn. Because the tests, the exams do not show we need field trips. The exams do not show that we're not meeting the needs and interests of our parents, our main constituents, which are our students. So, I'm a little angry and irritated that our regents, our commissioner, our chancellors, we have not figured out how to take, if these exams are necessary. So we just hypothetically say, these exams, we need these to show accountability. For over 20 years, let's just take the RCSD. What have we done with that information to show, as Dan talked about, student improvement? Show me. I'd like to see, because I don't take anybody's word for it. I'm sorry. I love Howie to death, but I'd like to see in black and white. If you show me the data of we're failing at an alarming rate, show me that in reverse. Show me that you've used this information, and that the main point out of the entire book that I like about Koretz, and I'm super excited about what we're doing, is test what's important. So my question is, are we doing that? Are the tests quality? Who's the writers? Who are the curriculum writers? So I think that we should be asking questions. Yes, we're providing information, but a lot of black parents and Hispanic parents are like, my principal said take this exam, it's mandatory. So how do we go beyond that to really create an environment for our kids that we're meeting their needs and interests?
If I can jump in on that, and I'll make it real quick, is that, for example, in terms of Eileen's point of teaching what's important, test what's important. If what we hear from, for example, the Common Core advocates is critical thinking, creative problem solving, using the community as a learning resource, where is that tested for? It isn't. So can we expect then that it's going to be taught, especially if kids, schools, and teachers are all going to be graded upon how well kids do on the tests? We can't expect it to be taught, even though we say it's important. So that's an issue. I mean, the other issues, of course, are music, art, and citizenship in terms of what we're doing with that. The things that are really important. I know Howie's chomping at the bit trying to get in here. Former school superintendent who has a perspective on this as well. So go ahead, Howie, and then David's got to jump in.
In the blue shirt, can I just grab your name too?
My name?
Yeah.
Dan, and I'll spell it for you later, the last name.
Can you just spell it to the tape though?
Sure. D-R-M-A-C-I-C-H.
How do you say
Looks
that?
wrong, but it's right. Dermisich.
Okay, great. And can I just get your name on the end also?
Yes, ma'am. Eileen Graham, E-I-L-E-E-N Graham, G-R-A-H-A-M.
Thank you so much.
And my name's Howard
Thank you.
Mafucci. That's M-A-F-F-U-C-C-I. There are a lot of moving parts to this issue. I want to try to keep this simple. I taught U.S. history and government to 7th and 8th graders for 14 years. I was an assistant principal for 3, a high school principal for 5, and a superintendent of schools for 14 years. I would not allow my children to take these assessments in the elementary school. There's so much wrong with the way it's being done, it's almost hard to figure out where to start. Now, I believe this: if you really want to promote change in a school, you empower parents. And right now, my advice to parents is opt your children out until this is fixed. I wanted to keep that very simple. Thank you.
Okay. David?
Well, I agree with you, but I'll say some more. So one of the things that Daniel Koretz urges us to do is talk about what we think is important to achieve in schools. What do we want students to learn? And then we need to figure out ways to assess that. And we're not doing that right now. What we're looking at is, we're saying that the only thing that's important is math and English. And we're only gonna assess that in one way, through standardized exams. So that narrows the curriculum to 2 subjects, eliminates everything else, and doesn't tell us very much about their learning in those subjects, because all we're getting is a standardized test score. So we're not really learning about what the kids know, how they're learning, and we're also not learning anything about how teachers teach, what makes a good teacher, and we're not learning anything about what makes a good school climate. These things are important. We really need to sit down and talk about, and that's what I hope we're doing, not just when Koretz is speaking, but at all of the community discussions that will continue after that, is to talk about what is really important and how do we achieve that. And as an example of the kind of discussion I want to have is, several years ago I had a grant, multi-million-dollar grant, to work in elementary and middle schools on issues around environmental health. And we were working in the 5th grade classrooms in one of the middle schools in the area. And the students were developing their own research around environmental health issues, and they happened to pick pet waste, which I didn't think was a real problem at first. But then after the students presented their research, I realized that pet waste causes many diseases. And the students were looking at the science behind that and also ways of reducing people's risks. And they did that research, and then they put together websites, pamphlets to hand out, did videos to educate their classmates, but also other people in the school and also in the neighborhood about these issues. So they were doing real learning about real subjects, and then we did that during part of 1 year, and then we came back the next year and we were told not to come back. And we asked why, given that this was so successful, and the teachers loved it, the kids loved it. And the reason that we were given was that the school had to spend all of their time, it was 5th grade, preparing the students for the standardized tests. Now then we had not just a literacy and math exams, we also had a social studies and science exam. So they partitioned up the whole year to focus on those 4 subjects in those test preps. So what's happening is we don't discuss what we want students to learn, we don't develop innovative curriculum, and we don't implement it in schools. We also need to develop other ways of assessing students. It's crazy that we assume that standardized tests are the only thing that we can do. There's lots of schools, such as the Performance Consortium schools, that use different ways of assessment. We need to develop lots of ways of assessment for different purposes, and they can be implemented in different ways. A lot of it is not intrusive in the classroom. Basically, when we did the work with the students in environmental health, we knew they learned something because they could put together a website in terms of what is the risk, what is the science behind this, and what do you do in terms of remedies. So there's an assessment right there. So we need to develop lots of other ways to assess. And we should be spending a lot of time and effort and money on different kinds of assessment rather than putting all of the money towards standardized testing.
One of the inevitable questions that comes up is, if not high-stakes standardized testing, then what? It's a question that you will get from boards of education, you get it from the regents, you get it from the New York State Education Department. Well, it just so happens that the Board of Regents and the State Education Department have approved over the past 20 years a model that David mentioned called the New York State Performance Standards Consortium Schools, of which a school in Rochester, New York is a member of, School Without Walls. And they don't use any high-stakes testing, except the compromise was to do English. So they do the English exam. Why, despite the fact that all the research that's been done, all the data that's been compiled on the students who graduate from School Without Walls and the other 30 schools in New York State that follow this same model, why hasn't it been expanded? Why haven't other schools throughout the state been granted the opportunity to replicate this project? When it works, when it shows without question that kids who graduate from School Without Walls and the other consortium schools go more often to college, stay in college longer, finish college more, are more successful with special ed students and students who are of a foreign language background. Why is that? Why don't we have that when the model is there? And other models could be developed as well. It's not to say that the consortium schools are perfect. They're not, but they're a heck of a lot better in terms of the outcomes than what we have in other urban schools.
Yeah, and let it be clear that we're not saying take testing and just throw it out the window. We're saying that testing should be one of an array of tools used to know what is being taught, is it being learned, from the teacher's perspective as well as from the student perspective. It would be insane, I think, to say that we're here today advocating for the elimination of testing. No, neither does our author, our invited guest, Dr. Koretz, advocate for it.
He's against the misuse of tests, but he says they serve a purpose, but they serve one purpose, and there's lots of other ways to do assessment besides standardized tests.
And I would like to add one more piece of evidence of the insanity of the system. Although there's a moratorium right now on punishing teachers, there are still teachers getting scores that never taught the student. It's astonishing. So teachers get a score, and they never actually taught the students being used for those scores.
And that's because they're teaching in either a subject or a grade that's not tested.
Well,
So they're
there's
tested by
flexibility in how you actually grade
teachers. Right.
a teacher.
But it's very possible that an art teacher could be graded upon the scores of students who are taking English exams.
Well, schools have to, oops, sorry.
You can just leave it.
So schools have the flexibility to come up with some ways to make these judgments. But remember, we're assessing, I hate the word testing, by the way, we're assessing students based on 2 areas. And there are teachers in the school who don't teach those subjects, yet they get grades. It has to stop.
Right.
And the way to stop it is to just have kids not take it. That'll force the system to come up with a better strategy, and I would strongly suggest reading the book. And by the way, Dan Koretz was part of the original research back in 2010 when cut scores were first manipulated based on some preliminary research out of New York City, and that research was never validated. So this really is a man, I think, that can bring a lot of good information to people who care about children.
I found it really interesting reading his book. I learned a lot about why high stakes testing have all these negative impacts. That there's something called Campbell's Law, that it's out of sociology, right? That when you put high stakes on just one measure, it's inevitable that it's going to get deformed, cheated on, that sort of thing. It's going to drive things, and that's what we see. Some of the things you might say, well, that's good. We've increased the amount of time spent on English and amount of time spent on math because of the testing. We've also changed social studies and science. They're much more reading based. They're not project based because, well, if they're doing reading, then we can still work towards getting the test better. And we'll count that as some of our English prep time. He talks about the cheating that does happen and has happened across this country. Explicit cheating of erasing answers and things like that. And the more subtle teaching of teaching only those things that you know are going to be tested. Not teaching the full curriculum. Those are all things that are caused by the high stakes, and it impacts our most at risk, most vulnerable children the most, because they're the ones that are at risk of receivership or being punished.
Here's another issue that we haven't talked about but is extremely important, is what impact does high-stakes standardized testing have on the pool of candidates that might be interested in terms of coming into the profession? Does it have any negative impact in terms of people going into the profession or not? But David, as a college professor, what do you think?
No, what we've seen at the University of Rochester, but also the other area universities, is that the number of students going into education as a career has decreased significantly. And in fact, enrollment is down about 50% at almost all of those institutions. And if you talk to people about going into teaching and why they decided not to go into teaching, they say that it's the emphasis on rote learning, on teaching to the test, on memorization, on doing well on multiple choice exams that is discouraging them from going into teaching as a career.
So they become actually more like technicians as opposed to making professional judgments.
Well, our student teachers, when they go out to schools, often we've heard back that they come back the first day and they say, well, I went to the school today and the teachers in the school were telling me not to go into teaching. And it used to be a good career, but it's not anymore, so you should drop out of the program.
Yeah. In my experience, I was that colleague, that staff member that the young teachers felt comfortable going to and confiding in, almost as a de facto mentor. And quite often, I would have conversations with very frustrated, anxious-ridden, wired-out young people who came to a profession with love, with desire, with creativity, with a vision, with a mission. Tell me, what is going on here? What I'm doing is nothing that I was prepared to do, from my experience to theory to the practice. And quite often, they would work their academic year, those 10 months, do summer work, constantly a self-driven learner. And I saw numbers of them before they achieved tenure or got to tenure and were not granted tenure because of the test scores, just leave the profession and move on to another area of life. It is not a happy moment when you see someone that comes in so loving what they're going to do, so dedicated to what they're going to do, just be crushed.
Well, many teachers complain that they're being de-skilled, that they've learned skills, they know something about teaching different subject areas, about assessing students, communicating, and yet what they have to do is teach towards the test, and it's basically they hand their own curriculum. And the skills they have, after a short while, they disappear because they're not using them. And they become de-skilled, that they decide the profession is not something they want. And we're seeing that all the time, not just in New York, but across the country.
As you've heard so far, this is an extremely problematic issue, high-stakes standardized testing, an issue that is very rarely dealt with by your boards of education. Hopefully it will be dealt with by the Board of Regents and the State Education Department, but we're kind of concerned that it won't be because it's become so much ingrained within the system. So our hope, as you can see from this kind of conversation, is that we can have more of these conversations. Not only people reading the book and having a conversation with other people who have read it, but also listening to the author speak on the 27th of September at Temple B'rith Kodesh from 5:15 to 7 o'clock. We've got posters here that you can take. But also to engage themselves in problem-solving groups, and we can make proposals to the State Education Department. So that's where we're at. We want to transform education into something that's better. Okay, we know we can't get there in one step. We know that poverty and trauma, we know that institutional racism, we know that inequitable funding of schools are all major issues as well. But this is also another part. This is a step in the right direction, too, to deal with this issue. It's kind of like what Barack Obama said the other day in terms of you can't do it all at once, but you can take steps to make it better. And this is one way that we can make it better for kids, teachers, schools, parents, and for society. Do you have questions you'd like to address to any of us?
Thank you.
And feel free to have a poster.
Thank you.
How do you plan to engage parents when that's such a challenge for many schools to hold open houses, hold meetings, and parents don't come because of the challenges they're facing personally. They often can't make it. So
I think one of the things, obviously social media is a very powerful tool, and really giving parents, as a parent, we're busy. Like, we're all busy. We, sometimes we depend on our advocates and our friends to kind of fight this fight. So I think for parents to get involved is really one thing that Howie said is making that decision that you're not anti-testing, but we need leverage. We need to be able to say we want to be parent partners. We also want to be a part of what's happening in the decision making. We don't want to continue to be told what to do. While I agree with what Dan was saying about the timing, at this point I am demanding that we make decisions that meet the best interest of the kids. The kids need to be at the center of what we do. I think that we've waited and we've asked, and I think that when parents say, I am going to make a decision because I have a right to make sure that my child does not take an exam that impacts the entire community. We, believe it or not, I strongly believe that parents really have the power to not only execute what we're trying to do for the entire district, but also even supports the work that the Testing Charade is telling us. What are we testing, what's important, and how can we be a part of making sure that this doesn't continue to happen? So we can't keep asking for that. At this point, we need to say, this is what we'd like to see happen. And I think, talking to parents, letting them know, kind of contextualizing it. Like, this is a lot of information from, different groups of people, different expertise. So I think that, I'm the type of parent, just tell me what you want me to do. Listen, I don't have time to go through reading a book. I do emphasize reading the book, I do. But what do we want people to do? I like to see parents say, I'm gonna make a decision. We have letters, I can email them, text them, inbox, however, you communicate. So I really think contextualizing this for parents, letting them know that as a result of their decision, we are taking back our community, because we can't have a great community without great schools. So our teachers are doing great. We have people who are fighting for what's inherently right for these kids. But the tests totally negate that entire process. So
we're reaching out to a variety of organizations because we intend to have follow-up discussions after the Koretz presentation. In fact, Dan, you could speak to that.
Right, we've got at least 10 different follow-up discussion groups scheduled all around the county, so.
In October and beginning of November.
Right.
Yeah, with what organizations?
With what organization? Well, we're going to be facilitating, but Rochester Teachers Association will be involved at various schools. We've got one at Barnes & Noble. We've got one at one right here on the 18th of October. And these will all be publicized on our website, and if you need a list, I can give you a list of all the places that
You're
they're
not going to
going to be.
actually sit down with any superintendents of these districts or principals to try and see if they can push
Well,
for change?
Potentially, yes. I mean, if we have a group, let's say that there's a group from School 12, for example, a group of teachers, parents, and students who, administrators who decide we need a conversation with the superintendent about this, because this is important enough for us to demand that the Board of Education be very vigilant in terms of lobbying with the Board of Regents and the Commissioner about changes that we want to see made. And so they could go there, they could take it in fact to the Commissioner, they could take it to the Board of Regents. All of those things can happen depending on the activism of the groups that are going to be meeting. So it's in the plan, and this is what makes this community read much different than that of others, is that this is an action-oriented objective that we have, to transform schools, to make schools better for kids. Other questions?
Well,
Go ahead.
About how you've been emphasizing the opt-out.
And-
They should opt out, and one reason to do that is because we've been asking now for 15 or 20 years for a more responsive assessment system than standardized testing, and the only way in which we can really get the attention of the regents and other people in the state department is by opting out, because that they notice.
Right, and I just need to speak to that for a second. There is a proposal right now, because the opt-out movement was very successful for a period of time, and now the state is supposedly developing a system to punish schools who have high opt-out rates. That's more evidence. Number one, we've gotten their attention, and number two, they're concerned about ensuring people participate even though they have very good reasons not to participate. And that's very concerning to me. And I do want to talk a little bit about working professionals, superintendents, principals. They do have to be very careful how they address these issues. They can talk about teaching and learning theory. They can talk about creating programs that are great for kids. They have to be very careful about telling parents what to do. Our issue is just ensuring that parents know their rights. And that is more evidence. There are school districts around this state that have quite honestly bullied families
Absolutely.
to participate because they can't come up with good reasons for students to take these assessments. My issue is in the elementary grades. As you start to move through junior high school and high school, assessments get a bit more important. But essentially what's happening in elementary schools is they're just making school not fun for children. And it's just horrible. And there's no real evidence, as is pointed out by Dr. Koretz, that high-stakes standardized testing improves teaching and learning. The evidence isn't there.
Any more questions?
On parental involvement, though, I stayed on that one. I had the most amazing 2 years when I realized, believe it or not, that there was an app that I could use. Everyone in this room has a phone. This app is called Seesaw, as in the seesaw in the playground. It permitted me to send real-time snippets, conversations the kids were having, notes home to the parents who would receive it instantaneously and reply instantaneously, telling me, wow, thank you. Oh, a meeting next week, I'll be there. We need to look at it from multiple perspectives. The paper, the white paper that goes home, that has been shown to not be the most effective way to do it. Phone calls that go home also, but this app was amazing. So in looking at the entire menu of things that can be used to connect parents, we have to also incorporate technology as it is today, and this app was fantastic.
One other bit of information that you may be interested in is that the Board of Regents, New York State Board of Regents, are meeting this month to decide whether or not the Commissioner of the State Department of Education, her dictum in terms of punishing schools that don't meet the 95% participation rate for testing, whether or not that will stay or whether or not there's going to be a modification of it by the Board of Regents. My understanding from the Chancellor is that they are going to seriously consider this, and hopefully they may have enough votes to water this down a bit in terms of what the participation rate may be. The other factor that's really interesting is that Howie mentioned the fact that we want parents to know their rights about opt-out. In fact, we made a proposal to the Board of Education and the Superintendent of Rochester that they inform every parent in the district that they have the right to opt their students out, should they choose. If they so choose, these could be the consequences that happen according to the state. And that may put some parents off, but at least they know that they have the right to do it if they so choose. So far, the Board of Education and the Superintendent have chosen not to inform parents of their rights,
We've been asking
which
since
is an interesting issue.
2015. Vicki and I wrote letters, we gave examples, we solicited help to make sure that it was awesome. And we still have not been successful in that fight. So thank you for bringing that up, Dan.
Any other questions you might have? We love to talk, so.
One-on-ones, if you don't mind.
Yeah, right. And also, we've got flyers here for any of you who would like to have more information about the talk by Dr. Koretz on the 27th of September.
No,